Archie, good morning. Thank you so much for taking the time today. I know you have a very busy schedule, so it's great to have you with us. And I know you're up to many things and lots of projects. So yeah, thank you for taking the time. So today's session is really going to be a bit about understanding, what you're up to, a little bit of the context at Spain's Hall Estate, and also just looking at kind of the vision of where you see the sector moving now, given the number of projects you're involved in. I'm sure you've got plenty to share. So yeah, I mean, Archie, over to you. We'd love to understand a little bit about how you got into what you're doing, your passion for it, what you're up to now, and your vision. So yeah, over to you.
Well, thank you very much, Tim, and thank you to Land Management 2.0 for extending this invitation and offering me the opportunity to speak to you. It is really good to speak to a kind of cross-sector audience, and I know Land Management 2.0's kind of stakeholder network and the collaborative element that you're pushing forward is really, really important. And I might touch on that a little bit more later, but just a little bit, you asked a bit of background about me. So at the moment, I run our family farming estate in Essex. So we're about 2,000 acres in North Essex, almost on the border of Cambridgeshire and Suffolk. And I've been doing that full time for about a decade. But also prior to that, I used to work for the Rivers Trust movement. I'm still a trustee of a local Rivers Trust. So I had a bit of a small amount of time working in kind of national policy at the outset of a catchment-based approach and various other initiatives, which was a really interesting time to be kind of ducking in and out of DEFRA and some of the Environment Agency conversations around catchment management and democratisation of that. And prior to that, I worked in the water industry for a short time. So I got a bit of a kind of insight into how that industry, which is one of the most important in my view in the country, operates, and how they have to think and how they're regulated and how they like to work with landowners. And before that, I mean, I did a biology degree up at Newcastle University, and during that I got heavily into the Newcastle University Canoe Club. So I spent my time on rivers. That came from an interest in rivers that has been really with me ever since I can remember. So, we used to go to Scotland on holiday, and the first thing I used to do at the house we used to stay at is go across the road, dive into the woodland, and go and spend weeks, or as long as I was allowed to, trying to dam the river. So, building rocks and getting the sticks and putting moss over them. And, I remember one year, it was fantastic because I managed to spend enough time building the dam, much to my parents' delight, because I was out of their hair, that I could actually walk over this dam that I'd built, which was amazing. But, just playing with water and being around water and, climbing up and down hills and seeing where water goes, and now being in the kind of lowland environment and understanding how water flows across, this is what sort of links everything for me. And it's really where I quite often start with any of my thinking is try and understand, what does the water do? So therefore, where are the connections, the physical connections between blocks of land? And that kind of naturally evolved mainly through my work with the Rivers Trusts on catchment management through the ecosystem approach. So this was something that I recognized from my kind of biology training as being everything is interlinked and everything is reliant on everything else in ways that we don't always understand, or quite often haven't really got a good grasp of understanding. And so it really sort of struck a chord with me that everything's interlinked, and so therefore we need to be quite careful as to what we do to alter, but also the resilience of natural systems. So if a natural system exists, then you can alter some parts of it, and in some ways the responses you see to that, so the way other parts of that natural system respond to the change that you've made, can actually pull out some really interesting insights into how you might be able to manage systems. Because it also all comes down to the fact that, particularly in the UK, because most of my experience is in the UK, we live in a managed landscape. There's very little natural wild land left, and there are increasing drives to try and bring some of that back, which is great. But equally, we do have a role. We are part of the ecosystem. We really need to know, or at least have a good idea as to what the kind of impacts are that we're likely to be having when we make changes. But then on the flip side of that, because of the resilience of diverse systems, my approach is always to try and reintroduce diversity. So, you know, we talk about diversity in everything from, you know, the makeup of businesses. You know, the more diversity you have, the more different viewpoints you have, the more different feelings and cultural connections and emotional connections you have. And it's exactly the same on any kind of management unit. So if you pull that down to a farm, then the more diverse your system is, then the more likely you are, or your system is, to be able to respond to change, because that change will impact different parts of that system differently. So if you take my business, for example, we've got, you know, we're majority arable farmed, but we also have a decent chunk, we're about 10% woodland. And then more recently, we've done what a lot of farmed estates have done, we've diversified into other businesses. So we've got other income streams coming in. So we do holiday lets and wild venison and things like that. And then even more recently, we reintroduced beavers as part of a flood project. And that in itself is bringing more sort of micro diversity into a small area where the beavers are working. But it's also then diversified us as a business and as a family, because we're a family business, out into areas of kind of social interaction that we didn't previously have. So, you know, we have land that feeds down to our local river, and that river then flows through the local village, and the local village is prone to flooding. And we're seeing more and more occasions when heavy summer rainfall or heavy winter rainfall starts to impact people that, you know, we don't know. So we don't know them in the village necessarily. You know, there's a turnover of houses, there's a turnover of residents in that village. So we can't always know everybody. But equally, if we start to introduce some diversity to our system, then we can start to introduce some resilience into their lives as well. So we can perhaps try and mitigate some of the climate change impacts that they might be seeing in a way that they couldn't. So, you know, if you've got a garden on the side of a river, you have that area of land that you have control over. Whereas I've got 2,000 acres that I can potentially have some influence over. And then you step back out into a catchment scale and you say, well, actually, you know, even that relatively large area of land on a catchment scale, you know, we sit in a catchment that's about 500 square kilometres. You know, that we are a small dot in the ocean, but equally we are able to influence certain things. And that, I think, is where I come to my sort of underlying drive, which is trying to understand as much about the social, the environmental, the human, the cultural underpinnings of what we do. And for me, it starts with a tangible, physical, environmental impact. So, you know, I know what the land looks like. I know what the woodland looks like. I know where those areas of land are. So my starting point is always, how do you take these sort of big concepts and drop them to a field level? Because it's all very well having a vision that works at government, which is to deliver public goods and deliver natural capital enhancements, which I fully support. But at some point, it's got to come down to, what do I do with this corner of the field? And how many different things can I do in the corner of this field, or in this whole field, or on my whole farm, to benefit as many of those things? And then also, how do I track that? So how do I prove to myself and to others that the things I'm trying to do are happening? But equally, how do I, and this comes back to a kind of scientific approach, is how do I track if they're not working? So I think that reporting failure, tracking failure, is as important as tracking success. We're all about proving impact. And, you know, you talk to investors and they want, you know, financial returns, but then some of them increasingly want non-financial returns, so impact returns. And it's all about data. But equally, some of the things that we try won't work. And I think one of the approaches that I try and take, rightly or wrongly, is to try and just get on and try things, and then put in place a framework that will allow me to pull out information, which will allow me then to make a judgment as to how successful that trying of something is. And I think this is something that, particularly now where we're in from the land management sector and the rural sector, and even just, you know, the economy as a whole in the UK, you know, we're in such a period of flux, change. We're coming under such pressure, you know, from COVID, but also from Brexit. We all need to respond. And I think there's so much uncertainty as to, you know, what is the right way to respond, that now is the time to really just focus on trying to collect the information whilst trying a huge range of different responses to that, because some of them won't work, but some of them might work brilliantly. And some of them might work brilliantly in one place and not work at all somewhere else. Exactly the same thing might be completely inappropriate in some areas. And I think this is a good process, because I think this is, accelerating learning. It's a way of pulling together communities, because if everyone's got a buy-in to the trying something, and as long as you go into it with an acceptance that you might not get it right, and you might not actually have the answer, but you're going to try, and you're going to try and do something, and you're going to do your best to understand how much that's working. And also you're going to be open to recognizing impacts and success in areas that you hadn't anticipated. So it might be that, for example, if we do some more beaver reintroductions, which we were hoping to do, and do some planning work around rewilding areas of the farm and trying to work with nature a bit more in some of the areas, it might be that actually we don't get the biodiversity response that we were expecting. But as part of that, we end up having a conversation with a social well-being and a healthcare provider. That means that actually people are the prime beneficiary of that. The health and mental well-being side of things might be, vastly more effective than we thought in terms of, bringing back a particular type of species or habitat. So, I think it's about being flexible, but this is very challenging. So it's very challenging from a policymaker's perspective to design a policy that is, that free-flowing and that free form. But also from a land manager's perspective, at some point you've got to make a decision to do something or not do something. But that is a fairly binary decision, even if that decision gets made every couple of weeks. Do I spray here? Do I spray there? What do I do? And then I think it's one of those things that you just have to try and be flexible with, and you have to find supporters, and you have to find kind of investors, but not necessarily in the financial sense. You have to find people that invest in you as to how you can do these sort of different things in a way that allows you to experiment, but also then track some of the impacts. So it's sort of, I come at it in quite a loose way, which means that my project planning can be a bit haphazard, which means that there's an opportunity over here, so I'll respond to that opportunity. But also there's this underlying framework, or this overarching framework, should I say, that I try and adhere to as much as I can. But none of the reporting structures really are in place yet. So I'm trying to design those as well. And we're trying to pick up the environmental impact and work with partners like water companies and wildlife trusts and rivers trusts to try and work out, what can you measure? What are your outcomes that you really want? And how do you do them? And how do you track them in order to try and get the best possible outcome, really? But it is difficult, because I quite enjoy being part of all these different conversations, and I enjoy being part of different sector conversations. So one of the brilliant things that has happened during COVID is things like this, where one day I'll be sitting on a webinar with the development of a British standard for natural capital accounting, and the next day I'll be sitting on a webinar around social impact reporting in the investment world, and then the next day I'll be sitting on one talking about the mutant eye of how do you actually do a piece of river restoration in a very small area. All of these things have value, but everyone comes from very different perspectives, and that I think is really important. And I do get slightly frustrated with some of the kind of policy responsive conversations, or some of the kind of reactive nature of things like social media, where people feel, because you've got such a limited space to express yourself, and this is why I don't really engage on Twitter and things like that, there's no nuance, and there's no space for nuance, and environmental systems and societal systems don't work like that. They don't find the right route and then stick to it dogmatically. And you can't have those conversations on in my view, you can't really have those conversations on something like Twitter, because what tends to happen is that those that are very adept at putting a single point of view then pile in, and it's their point of view versus somebody else's, and you become incredibly polarized, incredibly simplified very quickly. And as far as I'm concerned, nothing we do is that simple, and quite a lot of what we do isn't even that clear. We don't know, things like regenerative agriculture, for example, really brilliant, beautiful, all-encompassing term, which means as many different things to as many different people as it has letters in the two words that describe it. So, trying to categorize things, I understand why it has to happen in some senses, but it really frustrates me. What we do here, I've got 4 farming tenants, all of whom have a slightly different approach to farming. Some go down the technological route, some go down the traditional route. And then there's me with, doing things like the beaver reintroduction. Where does that fit in a sustainable land management thing? That was all funded as part of a flood risk project. But actually the impacts we're getting from that are much greater than flood risk. So, it's trying to understand how can you incorporate that level of complexity and that level of flexibility, and also reward and recognize those things that are done well, but also come up with a format that helps recognize when things don't work and comes up with a solution to trying to improve the outcomes of those things that don't work. So, rather than beating people over the head because their project didn't deliver the number of jobs that it was meant to under a rural development fund or whatever, you actually say, well, hang on a minute, you might not have done the jobs, but actually from an environmental impact or natural capital perspective, you really picked up here. Or from a social impact perspective, you really picked up here. And you didn't put any of that in your application because all we were interested in funding was the jobs bit. There's recognition, there's cross-sectoral recognition there. And the way I look at that, and the way I'm trying increasingly to look at it, and I don't have the answers for this at all, but is to take something I do understand, which is a natural capital appraisal. So run that, look at the ecosystem services that our land currently produces, feed into that a load of project plans that I've got to try and see, how does that change the underlying natural capital and the human benefits that produces, right across the board, from carbon to biodiversity to nutrients. And then my next step is to try and work out, well, how does that fit into a multi-capitals framework? So how does that look across the human, the social, the cultural capital? Because that, I'm very aware that that's something that we very often, we do internalize, particularly kind of social license to operate. Estates are very good at understanding their role in the community, but they're not very good at articulating it. And they're certainly not very good at collecting information to support that position. But also in the feedback side of things is how do you then use that information to change how you operate? So, should we be doing more in the community? And if so, what? But also, how do we do the community focused stuff alongside the environmental focused stuff, alongside the food production, alongside climate change? So, rural land-based businesses are a bit of a kind of microcosm of all of these conflicting demands landing on one area, because at the end of the day, most of this comes down to a physical area. So you can only do a certain number of things. There are a certain number of fundamental choices you can make with any area of land, and you have to understand the trade-offs. And a lot of this is personal preference. So, I know of estates where, their personal preference is very much about food security and providing as much as they can. And that's as valid as saying, I'm going to maximize my environmental production, but there's a trade-off there. And I think, this is now well recognized. And I think the discourse around public goods and, the emerging ELM support policies is exactly that. I think it's really good that conversation has had, but I think it's still lacking a bit of nuance. And this is something that I constantly struggle with, because I know that, you know, we still make decisions based on, you know, what we did last year and what we did the year before, and, you know, right, okay, we you know, this is how we've always managed that, and there's still that kind of inertia, and that's not always wrong, you know, because some of these things that we do habitually are done habitually for a very good reason. But I think that the challenge now is to try and understand that in a much broader context. And then you step back. I've done a little bit of work with international ag investors, and looking at how they would track their kind of non-agricultural impacts of land that they own or co-invest alongside, and particularly around regenerative agriculture, some of the environmental outcomes of that. And it's very clear that there needs to be a framework that is adopted by a lot of people at a lot of scales to get a really good handle for this. And so, you know, I looked at a few of them, and there are things like your friends at the Sustainable Food Trust that have put together a set of metrics which are very helpful, but still quite long and quite difficult to get your head around initially. Things like the UN FAO have put together the Sustainability Assessment for Food and Agriculture, the SAFA system. And again, it's, you know, it's designed to try and feed into UN SDGs, and I think that's got value. It's very difficult to understand that value at an individual farm holding level, but I think it is important. And I've been lucky enough to start working with you know, people at our local council and our county council, who are taking a really visionary approach to trying to pull together a lot of these conflicting interests around, you know, net zero and carbon reduction, climate change adaptation and mitigation. But it all very quickly comes down to, you know, what do we need to do and where? And what we're trying to work out is actually how, on a, you know, county-wide basis, could you roll out a framework like that? But also, you know, how does that then incorporate, you know, everything from social care to, you know, urban regeneration, to urban greening, to transport, to energy generation, to everything. And then you get into agriculture, water management, carbon sequestration. And so, you know, there's a lot of really interesting initiatives around this. And I think sort of estate owners and farmers are really at the forefront of this. And I think it's, you know, I have to say, I think it's probably unavoidable. You know, our generation now coming through, and the generation that's going to be quickly following us, you know, this is going to be bread and butter to them. And I think they, you know, we have an onus and a responsibility to try and get our heads around it, so that we can make our contribution more evident, but also make a more concrete contribution to all of these things. But at the end of the day, we also still need to make enough money to be able to function and operate. And how you do that is going to be very, it's going to be very location specific. So, you know, the way you do it on your farm, Tim, will be different to the way I do it on parts of my farm. And the individual farmers that I work with, you know, they have their own personal preferences, and those need to be incorporated. And some of them have, you know, different sort of prioritizations, all of which are equally valid, but equally it needs to fall within a bit of more of a strategic framework. So yeah, I think that's probably enough kind of waffle from me, Tim. I don't know if you've got anything you want to.
Yeah, Archie, it's I mean, so great what you say. I think you've really teed up the problem perfectly. I mean, so what we're saying is there is a transition happening in the sector from a traditional approach, which maybe in land management was propped up by BPS, and so that allowed a certain type of land use to be undertaken. The flux that's now come through Brexit and the transition to ELMS has caused all these new questions to arise, and these new needs to verify output to ensure that we can quantify our impact. Because of course we do need to make sure we're getting a financial return on any of the investments we're making. Anything we invest into the natural environment, of course, needs to yield a financial return in some way, shape or form. Otherwise, there's an opportunity cost on the bottom line. So I guess, and in this new approach that we're having to take, it requires a new framework. And that might be quite new to a lot of people because, you know, as we discussed earlier, you know, there's very few reporting frameworks that make that process of decision making easy. I guess the question that I've got, Archie, thinking about our farm here, like when trying to appraise strategy, so let's say doing a 3-5 year plan for the farm, in some sense, what are the questions I should ask if I'm coming at this totally from scratch and we know we need to play in this new market? What questions do you think we should be asking to document, create a framework, a well-considered framework to make sure we are making well-appraised decisions? I guess that's one thing. So one is, how do we plan and what framework should we use and what questions? And secondly, your other point, which I really thought was fascinating, is the value in being a part of many conversations at many levels with many subjects, which again obviously filters back into how you would consider what you do on the land at a field level. So yeah, two questions, one of which is, what questions should we be asking to build well-considered strategy? And two, how should we tap into as many conversations as possible to make sure we're continually refining and improving our decision-making?
I think it's great questions. And I think actually, if I take them in reverse, it will probably give a better answer. So I don't think you can necessarily know which questions to ask unless you're part of a lot of different conversations. So, I'm lucky enough that I have a, foot in the conservation world. I have a foot in the land management world. I have a foot in the scientific world. I still have a bit of a toe dipped into the water industry world. And then, I've been lucky enough to look at some of the financial side of things in terms of investor demand and investor motivation. So, I have a bit of a view across a lot of areas. And this is, I think, is helpful to understand, because the questions that I'm asking are as much framed by the context in which I operate as they are by any kind of underlying right or wrong. So, I have my personal motivations. My knowledge area is water, and how that links to land management and how people influence that. So, you've always got a natural starting point, and I think that's valid. For any land holding, I think you've really got to try and work out first off, what is it you'd like to see happen? What are the things that you value? Because there is credibility to that. So it might be that actually the thing you want to do is produce food that's consumed locally. And that then gives you a kind of prioritization framework to work with. And from that, you can then say, well, okay, any decision-making process in any business, you've got to work out, what is material to you and what is most important to you. So, what can you influence? And then what do you want the outcome to be? Once you've asked those questions, you can then sit there and think, well, okay, now we can ask those questions of people that might be able to help us answer them, but also then reach out beyond your kind of normal sphere to try and get people that will not only answer the question you're asking in a kind of traditional advisory fashion, but also do what good advisors do, which is challenge and say, actually, have you thought about this? Have you thought about that? Have you looked at this in the context of something else? The social impact of where you are. It might be that you're very close to an area that has significant challenges accessing green space. Is there something you need to do? You want to produce local food, but actually, is there something you can do with communities in that area that might help you produce the food, but also them access the food and access the natural environment where it comes from? So, it's very quickly becomes a bit of a snowball. This is why I don't think there's any one right answer to this, and there's certainly no one right framework to use. So, I took a natural capital approach because it appeals to the sort of ecosystem approach that I'm familiar with and I understand, and that I feel delivers a level of comprehension across complex landscapes that otherwise I haven't found anywhere else. But the guys that I worked with at Atkins to do the natural capital appraisal, they and I both learned a huge amount from each other. So I'm very aware that I have expertise in some areas, but there's no way I could do a properly broad-ranging natural capital appraisal on my own. So we went to the guys at Atkins and we built a team that included ecologists, it included hydrologists, it included natural environment specialists, it included flood risk specialists, all of whom put in a small amount of expertise that then delivered far more than its weight in time and value back to the natural capital appraisal, because it told me things that I didn't know. And I think this is the danger, that if you're trying to report or trying to build a framework that will tell you what you want it to know, what you want to know, that's all you're going to get. If you go into it with a much more flexible framework and you say, okay, these are the things that are potentially interesting to a load of people around, around me, around the policy environment, around whatever, context it is you want to draw. So anyone doing a natural capital appraisal, I would strongly urge them to go and find a provider or a series of providers who will offer insights into different areas and help them prioritize which areas are most material to them. Because if you're doing this for the first time, unless you've got a very sophisticated understanding of your landholding, you probably don't know, whether the potential markets for, let's say, nutrient reduction are greater than the market for biodiversity offset. And that's one level of prioritization. But then on the other side of things, the other level of prioritization is to say, well, what are the negative impacts my landholding is currently having on, let's just stick to the natural environment for the time being, so therefore which bits do I need to focus on in order to stop degrading my own asset, or prevent the deterioration, or even improve it over time. So it's very difficult. I see a lot of, and I've got a lot of respect for a lot of the people that are doing natural capital appraisals, but I think that it almost doesn't matter who you use, except that you need that team to be a team of specialists. So if you only look at it from an economic perspective, you will only get one kind of output. If you only look at it from a flood risk perspective, you will only get that. If you only look at it from a biodiversity perspective, you'll miss some of the economics and some of the flood risk perhaps, and some of the water quality stuff. So I would strongly urge anybody to try and assemble that team. And that's something I find interesting doing, is, trying to understand people's motivations and help people, pick out, the right members of team, or go to a company that's got the biggest, range of expertise, and then say, well, actually in our area, we think this is going to be most material for us. So for you on your landholding, Tim, I would say, you do that, is look around, and you will probably know, you will certainly be able to work out what is most material to you. So, what do you want to do on your land? So your 90 acres, you really would like it to be producing X, Y, and Z in that kind of volume. That's the place to start. And then you go to a selection of specialists, or, one company, and say, well, okay, right, we want to build that into a framework, but actually we want some consideration of some of these ancillary, or some of the other impacts that we maybe don't immediately recognize, like the social side of things, or the cultural capital side of things, which is something that we, ironically, as landowners, we're very, we're stewards of a lot of the country's cultural capital, but quite often it's an unrecognized activity in a lot of cases, unless you've got something of very high historic value, and I see, but it's something that we need to build in. Everything needs to be more holistic. It's quite a difficult thing to do on a practical basis. I do acknowledge that. And even I'm still sort of grappling with it, but trying to speak to people that have a much better understanding of it than I do.
And I wonder, Archie, whether that's a good point to go on to this whole endeavour of how do we turn the UK into a case study for the rest of the world? Like, it's imperative that the land managers, who are the custodians of all of these capitals in many, many regards, it's, natural capital, social capital, human capital, cultural, like all of these things, land managers have such a huge influence over, especially if we start looking at how the supply chains maybe start to localize and people get more connected to the source of their food. That's just a whole nother world that gets built that land managers are at the source of. So I guess with this, so to create the transition at a very local level, hyper-local level, the key component to change is building those teams, because it's from the teams, from that multitude of different inputs, that you can build frameworks and continue to appraise performance. So for change to happen, the teams are critical. because everything comes from that. So do you, in terms of the question about how do we turn the UK into a case study for the rest of the world, given there's 200,000 farmers in the UK, what needs to be done, Archie, do you think, to ensure we can elevate performance and appraise change so we can, as a community, keep learning, growing and refining, because we are going to make mistakes, as you said. What do you think we should do now?
I think it is really all of those things that you said. We need to come up with a framework that is endorsed by policy, that will help us as people that have management influence over land, and that to me includes anybody who manages any land, regardless of for what purpose they're doing that. And that's, local councils, it's wildlife NGOs, it's ourselves as farmers and landowners, it's anyone really. If everybody is if everybody is reporting into a similar sort of framework, then we will get a much better understanding of how the relative sustainability and the trade-offs that are being made over each of those land areas, because there will be trade-offs. And I think this is something that we don't have a very good feel for at the moment. And I'm not aware that there is any other country, territory or policy system that I've come across anyway that has a really good kind of holistic understanding of that. I think a lot of it we do by gut feel, to say, well, actually, in our urban environment, the sense of place and the safety and the accessibility for jobs and for community and things like that is more important than growing food, or certainly currently delivers more outcomes than a food production model. But we know at the moment that these things are getting very blurred. We can grow food in urban environments, and we can create community in rural environments, and we can create jobs. And you just have to look at where we're sitting now. I'm sitting in rural Essex, you're sitting wherever you're sitting, I don't know, down in your farm, and we're having a conversation that doesn't rely on geography. So I think that's it. I do wonder about this. Everybody wants their system to be the one that everyone else looks to be the case study. And I do, because all of these aspects will be balanced differently in different places, and the capacity for delivery of any particular selection and range and aggregation of ecosystem services or social capital or anything else will be different everywhere. I'm not sure that I necessarily buy into the concept of any one territory needing to be a case study. I think, that strikes me as coming from a kind of policymaker perspective, to say, I want to be the one who got it right. And I just don't think that's possible. What happens in the Corn Belt of the US is going to be completely different to what happens in, southern Spain and Australia and, regenerative agriculture, pastoral systems in New Zealand. So, all of these things, there are certain guiding principles that I think we can adopt. And I think the learning that comes from how we adopt those, but equally how we report both success and failure against those, being open about the things we tried that didn't work, is probably how the UK positions itself as being a thought leader on this. And I think it's already doing that to an extent. I think the thinking, the conversations around the way the rural agricultural system in this country is supported, enabled, the framework it works within has already had some of those conversations. But I think certainly one thing that I've come across in my career is that all I ever do is pick up people's ideas. I haven't really had any new ideas. And I think anybody that spends their life trying to come up with a new idea, well, good luck to them. But, that's not something I do. My jigsaw is made up of lots and lots of existing pieces. It just looks completely different for me than it does for everybody else. And that's not to say that I'm special. Your jigsaw will look different for you, even if you used exactly the same pieces as me, because you're operating with a different set of internal values. You're operating in a different physical environment, and you're operating with a different set of historical imperatives. So, you know, your jigsaw is your jigsaw, and it doesn't really matter whether it makes a picture that looks like the one next door or looks like the one on the box, because it's still a valid picture.
I totally agree, Archie, and I think it's so much more probably of an approach than a defined framework. And I think on a human level and a natural level and ecosystem level, that absolutely makes sense. I guess one of the challenges, which I guess we'll get to in the Q&A in a minute, is that if there's going to be consistent reporting methods to access new funding, will that start like countryside stewardship, you could say? It's like with countryside stewardship, you do these things, you put these features in these places and you'll get this amount of money. Now, the outcome of that isn't changing the value you'll get paid. So it's quite prescriptive. And I guess what we're saying is we are trying to move away from being prescriptive, and we are looking to move towards being more flexible, dynamic, and nuanced. And I guess, so whether we've got enough time now, but do you have any points on that? Like, if people are going to access new funding, that might imply a standardized framework for reporting, which might, you know, taint some of that flexible approach we've been talking about.
I think, I mean, certainly I can only speak from sort of personal experience that we have essentially built a partnership around the estate and around the projects, predominantly around the Beaver project that we've done, that aims to try and reveal some of the measured outcomes of some of the changes that we're doing. And that's certainly an approach that I continue to work on, because whilst I recognise that it is very difficult and in some cases not possible to physically measure a lot of what we're trying to influence, it is also possible to measure some of it. And I think that the promise of the Environment Bill, the 25-year Environment Plan, the Agriculture Bill, was that the direction of travel would be in that way, so that we wouldn't be in this conversation that we constantly come back round to, that, you know, we've paid for a load of actions, people have delivered on those actions as they were contracted to do, but we're not sure whether they've had the right impact, or the indices suggest that actually they're not having the right impact. And it tends to be at a you know, kind of mid-program or end of program time that those reviews are done. So what I'm quite keen to do is to encourage an underlying monitoring system to emerge, based on what interests you have. So in my case, you know, working with the water company, we've got surface water monitoring of nutrients and pesticides across the estate, and through the beaver enclosure, we've got, you know, surveys of birds and invertebrates and land use areas that fed into the natural capital appraisal. So I do like data, and I do like maps, and I do think it's one of the things that, you know, will help us in the future make decisions. I do think it's incumbent on DEFRA to set aside some proportion of every contract that they enter into with the likes of myself and others, to allow us to invest in gathering that data and reporting that data, so that both we have a better feel for what works and what doesn't, but also that we start to gather the information that will help the government and everyone else in society make more informed decisions about the trade-offs we make of land use, but also the things that work and the things that don't. So, you know, and also there are other partnerships to be had. So, for example, you know, I was working on one piece of our natural capital appraisal, and, you know, I go running, and one of the apps that I use is Strava, which I think, you know, a load of people use. Here am I volunteering my data on where I go sort of huffing and puffing around the landscape, you know, how often I do it, where I go, you know, really accurately. But that information, even for the footpaths and the paths on my farm, you know, I can look at it and say, well, on a Strava heat map, it looks like lots of people use that, you know, but that sort of information needs to be incorporated into our reporting. So for example, I at the moment don't know how many people use the footpaths on my farm. You can set up time-lapse cameras, which we've done to try and pick out some of this information, but it's very difficult. Whereas there's a whole load of people who go running around the footpaths and walking around the footpaths and riding horses around the bridleways, that are already generating that information, that if the government was able to, would be to pick up, private partnerships and pull out some of that information and say, well, actually, the ELM measure that we have done here to increase public access, or perhaps make the surroundings more attractive. So, manage the hedgerows in a particular way, which means that there are more birds there, which attracts more people to see them. We're not, as landowners, we're not in a position to report that information, but somebody else might be. So I think it's being quite novel and innovative as to, use some of these technologies that are out there to gather and report the information that, we don't have the capacity to do on an individual holding basis.
Archie, I think that's great. So actually what you're saying really is, if we can just measure the core objective data, then that's going to give everyone the basis to make better decisions.
I think it is. Yeah. I think it's about, it's the old adage, isn't it? I mean, if you don't measure it, you can't manage it. And if you're managing it, you really ought to be measuring it. So, it's not always possible, and it's very difficult, and it tends to be the bit that's added on to the day job. But, I do believe it is possible, and I do believe it's worth striving to try and get better information.
I mean, I think that could actually be, I can imagine a group forming where we start to take that conversation on and start looking at some of that. Okay, Archie, that's brilliant. I've got a few questions here from everyone, just conscious of time. So Chris has messaged, he has an estate in Yorkshire looking for alternative income streams for providing ecological benefit. So just to summarize what Chris is asking here, what funding is actually available to, get this change on the ground happening? He says it's not all about income, but they do want to make a positive change and would rather get on with it sooner rather than later. So Archie, any sources of income that you know about for environmental enhancements that Chris could look to tap into up in Yorkshire?
The magic money tree, no. I mean, everything that we're doing here is still on a very, very ad hoc basis. So the funding that we got for the Beaver project, for example, was a mixture of money that the estate put in, the Regional Flood and Coastal Committee, who normally fund the big flood defences, took a punt on our natural flood management project. And then also through the Rivers Trust movement, there was some funding made available from the Coca-Cola Foundation. So, it was a bit, it was a situation that was generated by, and a series of funds that were generated by the partnerships that I'd built up that allowed me to access those kind of funds. There's no specific, set aside funds for that. But having said that, the more you put yourself out there and the more you allow people to share your vision and allow people to input into your vision and have those open conversations, I would say to Chris that the outcome of that will be that somebody will come forward and say, I would love to pay you to do this. Now, the point of capital and revenue funding is a very pertinent one, because a lot of agencies and a lot of funders are very happy to do the capital works. So they will cover the cost of your trees, or they'll cover the cost of digging an attenuation pond, or they'll cover the cost of the fence, which in some cases is absolutely what the project requires. But from a valuation perspective, from a business planning perspective, I'm also looking for revenue streams. So I'm looking for contracts that will allow me to deliver these environmental goods over a period of time. For two reasons. One, because cash is king in a business like us. We've got a lot of assets, but we are still a cash business. So we still need cash to pay the bills. We still need cash to pay our staff. And, that is common, I think, to most landed businesses. The other thing is that the underlying land values that we operate in, the ability to borrow, the ability to trade, relies on, in parts, the revenue streams that are tied to that land. So excuse me, and the valuers, the valuers will look at a revenue stream over a piece of land. They will capitalize that over 25 years, and that becomes your land value.
Yeah.
Sorry.
No problem. I mean, Archie, I think, so what you're saying there, it sounds like, is that actually to get out there, build your partner network, get people to really embrace your vision is actually going to be the way of kind of accessing new funds sooner rather than later. And obviously what we talked about with the framework and the strategy is actually how can those projects that get funded actually turn into proper revenue streams that you can use to build your business. So I think,
yeah.
Chris, yeah, it sounds like, yeah, build the network and, yeah, get people excited.
I think that's it. I think we're at a stage now that you have to be pushing in order to get some of this stuff off the ground, because you will be a first adopter and you will be somebody who is doing something that hasn't necessarily been done very often before, if at all. So, you know, if you're not comfortable with that, then wait, because, you know, I'm fairly confident that these markets over the next decade will emerge. But if you don't want to, like I don't want to wait necessarily and see what ELM looks like, because I want to get on and make these changes now, that's, you know, so I'm going out there, I'm putting myself out there, I'm making myself available for partnerships and responding to other people's demands in terms of what they would like to see, and designing my projects in part around that as well as around what I want to do.
Perfect, Archie. And I think actually, well, Chris, if you're not already part of the online community, do feel free to join, because there's a lot of people having these kind of conversations on there. And actually, if you would see it valuable that Land Management 2.0, you know, puts on 4 group sessions and bring together the right range of stakeholders to help, then that would be a pleasure to do that. So do feel free to get in touch. Sue's also asked a question. 25,000 acre estate in Norfolk, and would like to undertake a natural capital audit. Any advice on where to start, Archie?
I think I come back to the point I made earlier, which is, find somebody to talk to about how what your values are, what you think you want your land to do, what you think it is currently doing, and then go out and find a natural capital provider, a natural capital appraisal provider who can speak to those, but also can perhaps bring in some other angles to it. So it's all about assembling a team, I think. And there are loads of people out there, and the guys at Nature Capital do a fantastic job of putting a natural capital grade together. So if you're interested in benchmarking your estate against others, that's one way of doing it. For me, I was more interested in understanding the quantum of the ecosystem services. So how many tons per hectare of stuff am I producing? So I went to a kind of technical provider to help me understand some of that. If you're more interested in making a statement around that relates to policy for payments for public goods, then perhaps you want to be looking more at the kind of environmental economics side of things. So it really is, there's no one place to start, and there's no one provider that I would say is better than any other at all. They all bring immense value. You've just got to understand which bits of the value you want to try and get more interest out of. Yeah,
and Sue, obviously through the network, so Alex Robinson at Nature Capital, I'll be delighted to connect you with him. But there are plenty of other people, even Jenny Phelps, who spoke last week. They are doing incredible things with UK habitat classification. So yeah, if you would like any support getting connected to people, then it would be a pleasure. So yeah, do feel free to message the Land Management 2.0 team in the online community, and we'll do what we can to help, because there are some other big estates around your neck of the woods who are doing really great stuff, and I'm sure everyone's very open to sharing. Okay, so Edward mentioned what specific outcomes are you monitoring, Archie, on your projects? I'm also conscious of time, guys, but very happy to take these next few questions if Archie, that works for you. Oh, you're on mute.
Yep, no, go for it. I'm happy to. So in terms of the Natural Flood Management Project, we've got partnerships with the Environment Agency, Essex Wildlife Trust, Essex Suffolk Rivers Trust, King's College London, Atkins, as well as a number of others. So we are trying to measure as much as we can in terms of the success of the Natural Flood Management Project. We've got water level data, we've got water quality data, we've got survey data looking at the extent of the emerging beaver wetlands. The difficulty for us is that because we're a very small community and the number of houses at risk downstream is relatively low in kind of flood risk management terms, there wasn't an awful lot of concrete data before we did anything. So, we know that, having lived around here for very many years, we know that about once every 10 years, there's a flood that impacts on people's homes and businesses in terms of flooding them out. And every couple of 2 or 3 years, there's a flood that disrupts the local infrastructure. So floods the roads and makes, traveling around very difficult. So, that's basically our baseline. So, over time, and it will take time, we will be tracking this much more carefully, but we've also got information on, what the water levels do and how the water moves through the landscape. But it's a fair point because, modeling natural flood management effectiveness is still an emerging thing. So the hydrologist will tell you that you can't actually accurately model the natural flood management interventions in the same way that you can model hard defences, because the parameters are so variable and their response to floods are so variable. So what we're trying to do is gather as much information and support the emerging evidence base for natural flood management by feeding into a lot of other people's information. And we're one small part of that. But yeah, in terms of our own project, we're doing what we can, but I wouldn't say that we've got the perfect monitoring program at all.
Okay, and actually on that point, Archie, given all the other points that we were mentioning earlier about the value of gathering data, do you think there's more that can be done to make data monitoring simpler, easier, especially, let's say, taking water as the example? Do you think we should be looking to find new investment into the technology that does simplify that and make it more accessible for the everyday land manager?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I think there's still a lot of research to be done. So, the partnership that we've got with King's London is rolling out what they call free stations. So these are low cost, basically DIY water level, weather stations, soil moisture sensor data. So they put together a system of building these things, and you can do them for a few £100. They run workshops as to how you can build them. They use components that are manufactured on a mass market basis. So, for example, the water level sensor that we use in that system, and the one we currently use, it comes from a car reversing sensor. So it just tells you, what level the water is at, and they then have the sort of clever bit behind it is to translate that into something that's useful on a flood risk basis. But I think it is important to balance the approach between the kind of high cost, high accuracy sort of approach that we tend to take in this country, certainly on a statutory basis, which has its role, along with much wider, much lower cost, much more real-time data, which has a lower degree of accuracy, but a higher degree of responsiveness. So if, for example, we're going to do things like water trading, we want to have lots and lots of water level monitors all over the place, both, measuring soil moisture, but also measuring flow in rivers, so that you can tell when when there's excess flow, and we can pump that out, put that in reservoirs, store it for crops, or store it for the environment later, and then release it later because the sensors tell us that there's not enough water in the environment, or not enough water in an aquifer, or whatever it is. So I completely agree. There probably does need to be more investment, but I would say it's right from both the research side of things, but then all the way through to the implementation side of things. So, farmers will invent something to do something that they need done. And there is a huge amount of inventiveness on farm, and a lot more of that needs to be harnessed, as well as the kind of, high level research stuff. So there's a balance there as well.
Yeah, and I guess maybe that actually comes back to your point about teams. Again, if it's about getting the right, data monitors on sites, again, it's about building teams that can, provide that kind of technology and also help you interpret the data, I guess. So it goes back to your point about being master of your own fate, and rather than necessarily relying on the market to support you. So Alex has asked a question. Currently working on nutrient mitigation proposals for development in the southwest. Following long discussions with Natural England, it's apparent that they are still learning about the process and agreeing appropriate types of mitigation, and consequently changing the goalposts. So they're looking at the Studmarsh report, which Archie has suggested as one size fits all isn't appropriate. So the question is, how can we as an industry ensure that we are overseeing authorities take much more regional site-specific approach that will reduce the risk of inappropriate measures being insisted on for your land or site? That is a great question, Alex.
I think this comes back down to gathering your own information as much as you can, because I mean the only way you're going to be able to prove that an intervention is more effective than either an intervention is less effective than has been suggested it would be, or more effective than another, is by having some information on the effectiveness yourself. And if you need to do that on a site-specific basis, then the onus, I think, sits on us to try and gather that information. And that's not to say that every farmer needs to go out with with any kind of monitor regularly. You need to build a partnership with somebody, find somebody who can help you do that if it's that important to you. But I would say that we are and we will continue to be reliant on models that suggest ways of working in areas, because we can't do that kind of test everywhere. So a lot of what we're doing here is trying to provide information which will refine those models. So again, come back to the King's College one, the information they're collecting on our estate around our natural flood management project feeds into a model that they've built, which is pulling together many, many thousands of data points to prove or to try and build the evidence for the effectiveness of natural flood management against property level resilience, so fixing people's houses when they flood. And I think there is a value to that, and we will always have to work on model data. So there will be certain amounts of being paid for actions that are based on models that suggest that this being done in the right place is the right thing. And I would say that in some cases these can turn up surprising results. In some cases they can get it wrong, but in some cases they can also challenge conventional thinking and suggest that actually doing the thing that you don't think will work may actually have the impact that is being sought. So I take a slightly more agnostic approach to this and say, well, I'm happy to work with any. At this stage, it's a trial and error thing. I think the policymakers need to also adopt the same approach to build into any scheme the ability for people to try things that they think will work on the understanding that actually it's a shared risk basis. So what you can't expect somebody to do is to say, we will fund this measure that we don't think is going to work 100% or to the same extent that we will fund the measure we do think will work. But I think there is a conversation to be had around, we think this measure will work. It's not in your package of measures because it hasn't been included in your model or it hasn't been appraised sufficiently. Let's split it 50-50. So we'll take 50% of the funding to get it up there, and the other 50% when it looks like it works or it doesn't. So if you're willing to accept some of the risk, then I think the counterparty should be willing to accept some of the risk. And the same then sort of feeds into deals with water companies and things like that. So there is a risk that some of the things you do to reduce nutrients for water supply purposes won't work, and the timescales are very, very long. Some of these things. So the water company has to accept some risk. The farmer has to accept some risk. And I think this is where we come into a much more dialogue-driven contract process than an off-the-shelf grant-making contracting process.
Archie, I think that's brilliant. I mean, yes, that was the last question, and I guess with everything that's been covered, to try and summarize it is, so much has been, we've gone through so much. It sounds like the key takeaways from this conversation are probably as landowners endeavoring to be master of your own fate, building partnerships and teams, whether that's with neighboring farmers or with academics or advisors or specialists, endeavoring to capture as much data as you possibly can. So again, whether that's a partnership with some kind of university to ensure that you are capturing the data that you need, and starting to understand the effectiveness of the decisions that you are making on your holding, rather than relying on, ELMS to give you, another countryside stewardship equivalent. So it really is about, being master of your own fate, deciding what works for you and how you want to play in this new market, and then doing what's possible to go out and get the deals that need to be got to, get the income streams that you need. It feels like the market's in that phase at the moment. And maybe another point to add on to that, Archie, I wonder whether there could be value in something like Land Management 2.0 if we can convene more conversations to make these networks easier to grow. I wonder whether there is a blocker to growing a network at the moment, and whether Land Management 2.0 can do anything to support that. But how does that sound in summary? And is there anything more to add or change in that?
No, I think you've summed it up remarkably well, considering the kind of wide-ranging conversation we've had. I mean, a challenge I would lay down for Land Management 2.0 is, are you only reaching a certain sector?
Yes, good question.
Are there any other sectors out there? Is the development sector involved? Is the local authority sector involved? I mean, I don't know what the makeup of Land Management 2.0 community is. It might be that absolutely you've covered all those bases, but equally, I think there is a risk that any one particular, there's a difference between having a safe space for a conversation, free-ranging conversation amongst friends, and then there is a role for having challenging conversations around conflicting priorities. And I think that the two are equally valuable, but they do probably need to sit separately. And I'm not sure what Land Management 2.0's aspirations are on that front.
Yeah, Archie, I think it's a great question. I think definitely it's to have an open conversation. I mean, anything we can do to move the needle and really make sure progressive decisions are being made and really effective land use decisions are happening on the ground, that's really what we care about. And I think one thing that we are realizing there's a huge amount of importance in is actually supporting facilitating the delivery of real world projects. These conversations are great, but we can talk until the cows come home. At some point, a spade's got to hit the ground. And I think that's really what Land Management 2.0 is here to do and support with. So, whatever we can do to bring in other players into the conversation that will support that, centralized IP of the sector, you could call it, then that I think is what we're here to do. So very open to that as an idea. Well, Archie, thank you so much for your time. I'm really conscious of the time now, and thank you for everyone coming and attending. I hope it was a hugely useful and interesting conversation. Please do join the community. There's plenty of people to chat to in there, not least Archie. And if anyone's got any ideas of anything else that we can do to support you in any way, shape or form, do let us know. We are here to, we are really a community to help support everyone in the sector. So do get in touch. We'd love to hear from you. Final thank you to Archie for joining us today. Thank you everyone, and have a great day.
Thank you very much.
Great. Take care all. Bye.